It's a well-known fact that African teams tend to suffer quite a lot in main global sports events like the World Cup and so forth. It is actually quite imaginable to see an African team going toe-to-toe with European giants. Bafana Bafana was only impressive in the early post-apartheid era when they won the Africa Cup of Nations, but now it will be very miraculous to see them make it past the group stages of the Africa Cup of Nations. But the Springboks are what I call an anomaly. The Springboks are the very same reason why I fell madly in love with rugby way back when I was still a kid, because I watched them during the 2011 Rugby World Cup when I was only 12 years old at the time. Rugby World Cup 2011, that game made me fall madly in love. I admit I loved playing with New Zealand because I loved seeing the haka before every match, but man oh man, I can't even explain the joy that the rugby PC game actually gave me. The reason why my love for rugby was only during the Rugby World Cup or Rugby World Cup events is because rugby tends to have the domestic level of rugby. When I actually compare it with, let's say, maybe football, or should I say soccer, or even when I compare it to the NBA, or when I even compare it to Formula 1, because Formula 1 they honestly suck, if I may put it that way. I know some of you will get pissed, but that's just fact. Domestic or club rugby needs serious work, and they need to revamp it to bring some prestige into it. For example, in football, the World Cup is the most prestigious competition, but in club level as well, you have the UEFA Champions League having global prestige as well. Even national club level leagues like the English Premier League are watched and debated by masses worldwide. This is the kind of prestige. During my research on rugby, one thing really stood out for me. It turns out that I wish rugby built at a domestic level. But anyway, merit because in your hands most of the time. But here I see rugby was part of a sport called football in its early days. Primitive forms of football included harpastum, which was played by the Romans, where two opposing teams competed to throw a large ball into an opposition net and fight for possession of the ball. Medieval Irishmen played a sport called CAD or CAD, which involved carrying an inflated bladder and using arched trees as goals. The Welsh played a sport called inter-parish game using a wooden ball called a napan. The French played shoal and the Georgians played lelo. Football as a game was well established by 1803 at rugby schools, and by the 1830s, running in with the ball in hand was allowed but subject to hacking and collaring. It was quite a fascinating revelation to realize that the primitive form of rugby and American football was literally called football. It truly goes to show you that as a soccer fan, I was truly ignorant and didn't even take the time to do research and try to find answers regarding these matters. If you are someone who pays attention to the way rugby players develop here in South Africa, then there is one thing you should have noticed. Rugby prestige derives mostly from the prestigious upper class level schools. One fact has always remained about rugby, much like American football in the United States, that tend to be development of most rugby players. They either come from upper middle class to higher class families, or they have sponsors or a backer who comes from such societies, and hence they could afford to be sent to these prestigious rugby schools. The fact in all this is not that rugby as a sport requires resources. No, not at all actually. Rugby doesn't need those kind of resources. But what truly acts as a deterrent for many kids is because there is no ambition from kids and schools that lie below the upper middle class in South Africa. There are very few school rugby competitions to a point that the sport starts to feel like a rich man's sport, or what we like to call a white man's sport, or a closed competition. Not representing skin color of course, but just representing an extremely well-off society. To me, rugby feels like a closed competition sport, a sport where as a kid from a below average income family you would never even think about playing the sport at a professional level. There are a few who end up thinking in that line, but it really takes some miracles and some circumstances in life for a kid from those kind of families to end up pursuing rugby as a professional thing. This matter would be easily solved if school rugby competitions became more accessible to schools under the middle class, but this also can put the sport at a huge risk, because why change something that already works? Personally, I believe since this system is already working, then just leave the system as it is, because changing it might actually lead to the national team's performance being affected and actually crashing the way Bafana Bafana is crushed. As I said before, since its early days, from inception, rugby has always been an upper-class sport found in prestigious schools. Former rugby school student Albert Pell is credited with having formed the first football team while a student at Cambridge University. Major private schools each used different rules during the early period, with former pupils from Rugby and Eton attempting to carry their preferred rules through to their universities. A significant event in the early development of rugby football was the production of written set rules at rugby school in 1845, followed by the Cambridge rules that were drawn up in 1848. Formed in 1863, the National Governing Body, or the Football Association, the FA, began codifying a set of universal football rules. These new rules specifically banned players from running with the ball in hand and also disallowed hacking or kicking players in the shins, both of which were legal and common tactics under the rugby school's rules of the sport. In protest at the imposition of these new rules, the Blackheath Club left the FA, followed by several other clubs that also favored the rugby rules. Although these clubs decided to ban hacking soon afterwards, the split was actually permanent and the FA's codified rules became known as association football, whilst the clubs that had favored rugby rules formed the Rugby Football Union in 1871 and their code became known as rugby football. The first Rugby Football International was played in 27 March 1871 between Scotland and England in Edinburgh. Scotland won the game by 1 goal and 1 try to 1 goal. By 1881, both Ireland and Wales had representative teams, and in 1883, the first international competition, the Home Nations Championship, had begun. In 1883 is also the year the first Rugby Sevens tournament was held. The tournament was called the Melrose Sevens, which is still held every year up to this date, which is really quite impressive. The competition actually dates back from before the FIFA World Cup. I never even knew rugby had such a long and beautiful history. It's quite a fascinating sport to research. Two important overseas tours took place in 1888. A British Isles team visited Australia and New Zealand. Although the visit was a private venture, it laid the foundation for future British and Irish Lions tours. And the 1888 to 89 New Zealand native football team brought the first overseas team to the British spectators. The first two notable tours both took place in 1888, the British Isles team touring New Zealand and Australia, followed by the New Zealand team touring Europe. Traditionally, the most prestigious tours were the Southern Hemisphere countries of Australia, New Zealand and South Africa making a tour of the Northern Hemisphere, and the return tours made by joint British and Irish teams. Tours would last for months due to long travelling times and the number of games that were actually undertaken. To give you some perspective of just how massive the number of games they actually played, the 1888 New Zealand team began their tour in Hawke's Bay in June and did not complete their schedule until August 1889, a year later, after playing 107 rugby matches. That's right, literally 107 rugby matches. Between 1905 and 1908, all three major Southern Hemisphere rugby countries sent their first touring teams to the Northern Hemisphere. New Zealand in 1905, followed by South Africa in 1906 and Australia in 1908. All three teams brought new styles of play, fitness levels and tactics, and they were far more successful than critics had expected. The New Zealand 1905 touring team performed their haka before each match. I absolutely loved the New Zealand haka from a young age, honestly. It looked absolutely beautiful when you're actually a supporter of New Zealand, but very terrifying when you're going against them. For those of you who don't know what the haka is, let me try to quickly look into that. So the haka known as Ke Mate is a Maori haka composed by Te Rauparaha, war leader of the Ngati Toa tribe of the North Island of New Zealand. From what I could gather with my little knowledge, this is somewhat of an ancient war cry. Te Rauparaha composed Ke Mate in 1820 as a celebration of life over death after his lucky escape from pursuing Ngati Maniopoto and Waikato enemies. Kamate is the most widely known haka in New Zealand and internationally because a choreographed and synchronized version of the chant has traditionally been performed by the All Blacks as well as the Kiwis immediately before all test matches, until 2013 of course, when a specific haka known as Te Iwi Kiwi was used instead. Despite rugby football having such a long and beautiful history, Surprisingly, the idea of a Rugby World Cup started very late. The FIFA World Cup was created decades before the Rugby World Cup, which actually began in 1987, when the first Rugby World Cup was held in Australia and New Zealand, and the inaugural winners were New Zealand. The first World Cup Sevens tournament was held in Mauritfield in 1993. Rugby Sevens was introduced in the Commonwealth Games in 1998, was added to the Olympic Games in 2016. The Tri-Nations, an annual international tournament involving Australia, New Zealand and South Africa, kicked off in 1996. In 2012, the competition was extended to include Argentina. Basically, the higher-ups in rugby football love this system of prestige and honor, where the sport actually feels like a rich man's sport or a closed competition. Maybe it's just their preference, but this is exactly why you see the same thing happening in high schools, as if it's nearly impossible to find a school with majority students below middle-class families actually participating in major well-known school rugby competitions. One fact still remains though, the Springboks are the pride of our country because resources are used very well in the sport of rugby and the development of young talents is handled very well by different schools and institutions. When it comes to every sport in the world, it's all about resources. A sport that has resources is bound to flourish in a specific country. For example, how there is so much focus throughout the world in football, most of them being Brazilian, for example. And then you see sports like the English Premier League building the prestige of the league instead. When resources are put behind a team, the way resources are put behind Springboks and the development of rugby players in the country, the Springboks are bound to become the best team in the world for a while, and it's really impressive and it's really a blessing to the country itself. So this video was not to say we are bashing rugby or rugby has racism or rugby is unfair. No, I believe that rugby is actually very inclusive these days. You see a lot of black and colored players these days, a lot of them. So you can see it is inclusive. But the beautiful part about it is they managed to maintain the prestige behind the sport. So the prestige itself doesn't have a bad side. It does have a small bad side in a sense that not just anyone can access the sport at a higher level, starting off from grassroots level. It's not really easy. You need to have a backer or you need to be lucky enough to be sent to a school that is prestigious enough and known in the rugby world. I actually believe they should actually maintain this system. This system that seems unfair or in any way or in one way or another, they should actually maintain this system because this system is working. This system is leading the Springboks to winning the World Cup. And look at how England also performed. England performed really, really well because England also has a prestigious rugby school. New Zealand also has some prestigious rugby schools as well. So when there are resources behind a team and resources behind a sport and they are used properly to build the sport and promote the sport, then you will see teams flourishing. Springboks, New Zealand. You can see Bafana Bafana is struggling because we don't know where the resources are going. We don't know how the money is being spent. And you don't see the direction in which the development of players is going. It's all about money only when it comes to the players themselves.